Okay, so last week we talked about the city of Irvine as being a prime example of a planned community. And we talked about the big orange spot. Remember that story that I read to you about the big orange spot? So I brought along some slides today and to show you what that looks like in Irvine, actually. And today we're going to be talking about nature, the effects of nature on people. And there's a lot of really interesting research about that topic. So as soon as we get the slides pulled up, we'll go. There you go. All right. So go to the next slide, Mark. This is the Crone Castle House. And if you go to Deerfield on Yale and you make a right down that street, and then you make a left a few blocks down, you'll come to this castle house. And it's pretty atypical for the designs that the Irvine planners put up here in Irvine. And as I mentioned last time, it caused quite a stir. There have been various lawsuits about that house because it was so different. So what article does that bring up to you that we talked about last week? Remember an article that talked about some of those issues that play out in planned communities? Well, we talked about individuality versus communality or conformity. We talked about orderliness versus disorderliness. We said that places like Irvine and Laguna Beach are quite different on those continua, with Irvine pretty high on orderliness and sort of community conformity. And so this example here really stands out as somebody sort of going against the grain, trying to be a little different by adding on these towers and this stone kind of facade to their house, making it look kind of like a castle, just like Mr. Plumbean did in the big orange spot. Now, when we talk about nature, you have to talk about Central Park in New York. What a huge investment was made by that city to create this wonderful green space in the middle of the city there. And today in Orange County, we have a similar effort to create the Orange County Great Park. And this is a plan for the Great Park, which is built actually around the runways of the old El Toro Marine Base, the air base there. And you can see some of the different regions that they're going to have canyons built there. They're going to have a cultural center and terrace. It's really going to be an amazing project and quite a bit larger, actually, than Central Park in New York. So why did the Irvine Company and the city of Irvine go to such lengths to preserve all that open space? And that's a pretty interesting question because, you could use that space for a new international airport. You could use it to create factories or light industrial. So why put it all into a park? And I think, for many years, people assume that nature is nice. If you can be near nature, it's a good thing. But if you're somebody managing a company and you have to make a decision about whether to bring landscaping into your company for your workers, you might think twice about that. How's that going to affect my bottom line? It's a nice thing to have. It's an amenity. But does it really affect the corporate bottom line? And I think what we're going to see from the research today is there's a lot of striking evidence that people hadn't thought about before this field of environmental psychology that shows that proximity to nature has very direct, tangible effects on outcomes like health, on outcomes like crime, psychological states, psychological distress. So we'll go through some of that research. It's a quite interesting topic. Now, before we do that, I want to play another video that was created by the Irvine Company. And I played one of those last week, but the reason I want to play the one today is because it has a lot of comments by Ray Watson. We've talked about Ray Watson being the first president of the Irvine Company. And he came down from Berkeley after getting his degree in urban planning, had read Kevin Lynch, wanted to make this an imageable city. And I want you to hear from Ray Watson because, certainly the Irvine Company wanted to be profitable, and their commercial properties, their residential properties have been extremely successful. But they also showed a kind of vision to preserve open space. And this planned community has some of the largest tracts of open space that are preserved for perpetuity of any planned communities around. So I just want you to hear from Ray Watson. It's a pretty interesting set of comments.
had a mosaic of what the Irvine Ranch is, and you try to describe it, one way I describe that is a necklace. And a necklace that has all different kinds of beads. But each bead would be a village. It might be a business area. It might be a commercial area, tying together the different communities.
The Irvine Ranch is located in the center of Orange County. Its land area comprises about a fifth of Orange County, and it extends 22 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean. On the ranch are the cities of Irvine and part of Laguna Beach, Newport Beach, Tustin, Orange, and Anaheim.
The Irvine Company is a company that has been in existence for well over 100 years. I'd describe the Irvine Company, first of all, as the owner of probably one of the most fabulous pieces of property in Southern California, maybe in the country. But what it became is the master planner and then the master builder of the communities that you now see on the Irvine Ranch. The mission of the company was established in 1960 when the company committed to build a new town around the new University of California that was to be established here. We worked hard to try to tie all of those various elements from open space to recreational areas to educational facilities to the residential areas together in such a way that those who live or work there feel like it's all theirs. It's all part of the communities they live and work in and play in and have fun in and enjoy life.
You have the Pacific Ocean, you've got the coastal foothills, you've got the Central Valley, and one of the most magnificent things is that almost no matter where you are, you're aware of canyons and wild landscape. Just some of the most beautiful land that you could find in Southern California.
When we began to plan this property in 1960. The residential villages were to be diversified. We wanted to have a variety of housing types. That's part of the strings of that necklace that integrates all of it together. We wanted to have a mixture of commerce, that is where people can shop at the neighborhood or regional shopping center. Entertainment centers, which we now have in the Irvine Spectrum. We wanted to have smaller recreational areas throughout the ranch where we have places for children to play, small tot lots, up to the diamonds where the little leagues will play baseball. The amazing part of the Irvine Ranch is the fact that it has natural habitats. It has canyons. It has groves, it has places where the birds live and nest, where the coyotes dwell. This is part of the history of this property. The original master plan for the 93,000 acres had 11,000 acres of it devoted to open space. Now that number is 50,000 acres, which means that the company has made a commitment to leave open and not develop as much as one half of the entire Irvine Ranch. This is extraordinary. One of the great values of this open space is the relief it's going to give to the urban communities that it surrounds. It enriches the communities. It defines the communities. It also preserves natural habitats, and it provides recreation for the residents that live here. I think history is going to note as much attention was given monetarily and time and planning-wise to the open space as it has to the urban development. For more than 40 years, the Irvine Company has been guided by a master plan, a plan that's been the foundation for the exceptional quality of life people continue to enjoy on the Irvine Ranch. The diversity of the villages, the educational excellence, the economic vitality, the beauty, it's all here. And best of all, it will be all here for the ages.
So that's a pretty good promotional video, but I think, there are some important kernels to it in terms of the emphasis that was given in this region as it developed to the preservation of nature and open space for the people living here. And as we go through the research today, you'll see that that was a pretty wise decision. Now, we know that in many communities, they don't have the luxury of being close to so much nature. And we'll see from some of the research studies we talk about today that low-income communities typically have very little nature. And yet when you find those low-income communities that have proximity to some nature nearby homes and apartments, it has a very beneficial effect on those people's health. So let's take a look at a few things we've talked about in the course so far, and then we'll go into some of that research. So this is the design guidelines for South Main, and you can see how the emphasis here is on adding street trees to that community. And what this does is it makes it a more walkable, sociable, safe kind of place. Here, we have some of the most beautiful trees, street trees in the world, in California. This is in Cambria, along the Pacific Ocean, and some of the cypress trees you get there. This is San Luis Obispo, Main Street, where you have these tremendous, very verdant trees integrated with the sidewalks and right up near the storefronts. And here you've got Paso Robles, which is also in Central California, where they have a summer art fair, a lot of emphasis on trees, walkability, and actually a few other observations I put in here when I was going through that area, noticing some of these symbolic barriers outside a home in Paso Robles, and also, getting back to environmental cognition, some very confusing signage here because you've got both of these freeway signs pointing to the right, north and south. So many of you could do a project on confusing signage. If you look around you in a lot of different environments, oftentimes it's pretty hard to find your way because you're getting not very clear cues from those directions. We also talked about the growth of the green roof movement, and one of our students is working with the Green Initiative Fund here on campus to promote green roofs at UCI. This is in Chicago at City Hall. Now, when we turn to the research, okay, it's great to have all this emphasis on greenery. Does it really make a difference in terms of people's health and well-being? So these are some of the studies and books that have been published on that by Steve and Rachel Kaplan at the University of Michigan, Experience in Nature, and then this book by Charles Lewis. And we'll talk about some of his research on gardening programs near low-income housing projects in large cities. We know from this research, as we've already said, that the ambient environment, even though we don't think much about it, we kind of take it for granted. If we're a patient laying in a hospital room looking out a window, we've seen from Ulrich's study that that can influence speed of recovery from surgery, the amount of pain medication taken. It becomes part of the therapeutic regimen in that environment just by having that view amenity out the window. This is a theory that we'll be talking about today by Steve and Rachel Kaplan, and there's a section from their book that you read which explains some of the main assumptions of their theory. One of the assumptions is that when people have to use their directed attention, like focusing on the lecture and taking notes, that's using your directed attention, and you're having to screen out any kind of distractions because those distractions compete for your focus. So people get fatigued, their attention gets fatigued and depleted when they're engaged in this for too long. So if you're going, full bore through the academic quarter with several courses and you're studying for exams, writing papers, by the time you get done with that quarter, you've got a certain amount of directed attention fatigue going on. Now, another concept that's key to their theory is that in order to replenish attention and to recharge those batteries, they talk about restorative environments. Those are environments that have certain kinds of properties or features to them that enable people to exercise what's called spontaneous or involuntary attention, undirected attention. You don't have to direct it or focus it. You just can focus on anything that you find interesting. And when you engage in that kind of spontaneous attention, it replenishes your capacity for directed attention. So those two types of attention work hand in hand, and this is a distinction that was developed back in the 1800s by William James, one of a famous psychologists from that time. So what they claim is that when you're trying to focus on something, you have to inhibit other stimuli. You have to maintain that focus. The other distractions compete for your focus. So that's what they call inhibition, trying to inhibit any potential distractions. And that takes work. It takes mental work to exercise that attentional focus. This is James' distinction between voluntary and involuntary attention. And Kaplan's call voluntary attention directed attention. They've sort of renamed it, where you're really focusing and directing it toward a particular focus. But it requires effort. You have to screen out distractions to stay on task, to stay focused. And it's susceptible to mental fatigue. If you do that for too long, you start getting tired. You don't have as much attentional capacity to do that. And we saw that with the lawnmower study, right, where somebody's walking down the street, another person drops a box of books, and in an environment that's very noisy, they don't even notice the fact that the person might be wearing a cast on their arm and may need some help. So the norm of social responsibility goes by the wayside because people are overloaded. Their attention is overloaded, so they can't pick up that cue and help the person out. Involuntary attention requires no effort. It's captured spontaneously. So if you go into an extremely beautiful canyon, or you're looking at a beautiful painting in a museum, or you look at a flock of geese flying through the air, this captures your attention, or you hear a loud sound, or the earth starts to shake. You don't have to think about that. You just focus on it spontaneously. So no effort is required, and typically that restores, when you engage in that type of attention spontaneously, it restores your ability to focus and engage in voluntary attention. So as I said earlier, they work hand in hand, and they're kind of a dynamic there. And when you use too much of the voluntary, you need to exercise some of the involuntary. We already have seen that when you have directed attention fatigue from too much overload and too much focus for too long, a lot of problems can occur. And we've seen this in medical errors. This book here, To Err is Human, is all about hospital errors, amputating the wrong limb, for example, giving somebody the wrong medication. Air traffic controllers run into this problem because they're so focused, they're trying to direct their attention to saving people's lives by managing all those flights, and sometimes they just get fatigued doing that. They get more irritable, aggressive, they lose sensitivity to social cues. So these are some of the costs of too much directed attention, and when you get fatigued from that. Now, one thing to notice is that there's a difference between mental fatigue or attentional fatigue and stress. Stress is defined as a situation where you're appraising it as potentially threatening and negative. Mental fatigue can occur from stress, but it can also occur from working on projects that you really love. So somebody is immersed in a paper because they're really interested in the topic, or in creating a novel, and they stay up, don't get enough sleep, they get mentally fatigued, but it's something they really love doing. So it's a little different than stress. Mental fatigue is not exactly or totally overlapping with stress. So that's an important point to know. Now, what are these features of restorative environments that the Kaplans talk about? Well, one of the key features is that they enable people to engage in spontaneous attention. They enable people to be fascinated. Okay? And they also provide the experience of getting away, so taking a vacation. But sometimes people can get away through meditation. They can get away by taking a break from their work, going outside, taking a walk in a nature park. Another aspect is what they call connectedness and extent. You're able to connect your current, present, immediate environment to something broader than you. So you're on a mountaintop, thinking about sort of the state of the world or nature and the meaning of life, and you're able to kind of connect your immediate situation to something much broader. You feel connected to the universe or to broader natural processes that are ongoing around you. So restorative environments often engage that kind of feeling of being connected to something larger than yourself. It's not just your immediate local situation, but you're part of something bigger. They typically afford compatibility, where you feel that you belong there or you're doing something you like. Some people can go into a museum and look at an art exhibit and they're kind of bored, they don't really want to be there. Somebody else can go and get restored because they're really reveling in the beauty of that artistic product that they're looking at. So for some, it's a very compatible situation. For others, it's not. And compatibility is something that enhances restoration. People can go into a museum and come out with very different experiences depending on whether they feel that fit, that congruence or not. Compatibility does not mean controlling the situation. In fact, in a lot of situations, you feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the universe or the world. You don't feel you're in control of it, but you feel somehow at peace with it or connected to it. So compatibility is not necessarily control over the environment. And finally, there's a balance between mystery and serenity. So restorative environments aren't so mysterious that they get scary. You can be in a wilderness environment where you don't know whether a wild animal is going to jump out at you at any moment. And some of the trails around Southern California, you may have mountain lions. You see signs to be careful about mountain lions. And there have been attacks in some of those parks. So too much mystery can be a little bit overwhelming and stressful. So you want environments that aren't too predictable and too uniform. And some would say, well, Irvine, they did such a great job planning this place. And there's so much beautiful nature, but it's too predictable. There's not enough sort of chaos. There's not enough diversity of activities and types of people. They have perhaps diverse neighborhoods and villages, but where's the diversity that you might see in some other areas? And actually, Irvine has quite a high degree of ethnic diversity, although in terms of income diversity, it's not so dissimilar. Mostly it's upper middle class or middle class, but the ethnic diversity is certainly quite high in Irvine. Anyway, these are some of the key features that the Kaplans talk about when they present their theory of restorative environments. And many of you can think about environments that you frequent or you have at your disposal at home or maybe near campus that you go to in order to get that sense of restoration, to get away from all that mental fatigue of too much directed attention. So what are some of these features? Getting away. So this is Harbor Boulevard in Anaheim. And when you talk about getting away from something, somebody goes into a nature experience who lives in a large city. Perhaps they live in Costa Mesa near Harbor Boulevard or in Anaheim. That's what they're getting away from. They're getting away from all those wires and all that traffic and all that sort of visual clutter. And that's one of the things the Irvine planners tried to get away from. They wanted to bury those lines under the ground, put the cables underground, have signage that was very unobtrusive, very low to the ground, so that people didn't feel overwhelmed by all the material signs, but rather, made them more out of natural materials and lower scale, more human scale. So this is, getting away from some aspect of life that's ordinarily present, and maybe you don't like so much of it, so you want to retreat from that and see something else. We can talk about natural restorative environments, and certainly our national parks, many would say, are extremely restorative. You go there, you don't typically hang out in the national park, and you see some wondrous sights there and wildlife. And so it's getting away, it's spontaneous attention, looking at a sunrise or sunset in that environment. But it's also the case that urban environments can be restorative. And in the next slide, we have an example of that William White talked about in his film, The Social Life of Urban Spaces, where this pocket park called Paley Park is a kind of restorative urban environment. People go into that setting because of the water sounds and because of the trees and because of the informal social atmosphere there to get away from the din of the city. Even though right down on the sidewalk you've got, many, many people walking by and you've got the cars and the taxis and everything else. But in that little pocket park, you can get some restoration during your day. And, we've talked about the value of parks. Orange County Great Park, Central Park, Paley Park in New York. And I want to show you an effort here by a group called Rebar to create sort of impromptu parks in large cities like New York, San Francisco, by occupying and taking over parking spaces. So it's kind of an interesting approach.
It's going to be one of the taller loads we've carried. One of the main areas of interest for Rebar is exploring these niches in regulatory frameworks or social codes that govern the way people behave. And in doing some research on a parking space, we discovered that in San Francisco County, it appears to not be illegal to occupy a parking space for uses other than a car. And a downtown area is underserved by public open space. So we figured we'd do our civic duty and create a little sliver of public open space for a short period of time to serve the lunchtime crowd and to temporarily expand the public realm. In order to build a park in a parking spot, first thing you need is obviously the material from which to build it. So you need your sod, you need some kind of tree, greenery, nature, you need a place for people to sit. That's really important. You look at the environment. Is it going to be high traffic going by, or is it the kind of place people are going to actually want to stop and linger in the park? And finally, you need a little bit of signage to tell people what it's about. And having some flyers nearby, it tells us what the project is, trying to do. It doesn't hurt either. So that's it. And once you do that, you got your park in a parking spot. Today in San Francisco, we're doing 5 parks that are all deployed exclusively by human-powered transport.
Great day for parking day.
Can't stop the song.
You know what? I kind of like thought I was in Twilight Zone. I come outside and there's a park right here. You know what I mean? That's what I mean by that. It's like, where am I at?
I like the idea of bringing parks into the city and bringing awareness of open space.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Oasis right in the middle of the city.
What'd you think of it when you saw this green
It blew my mind. And this is real grass too, man. This ain't none that, what do you call it, astroturf. This is real grass, man.
I like that as activism, it's very playful and it inspires and sort of delights, as opposed to, like, you don't have to scream your message. You can kind of just be playful about it.
There are also about a dozen or 14 or so other groups that are doing this in solidarity with us. So there's parks all over San Francisco right now that have been built by independent groups, each with their own agendas, each with their own kind of reasons for doing it. And I think that one of the powerful things about this installation is that it speaks to many different people on many different levels. And so people that are interested in public open space or urban planning or alternative transportation or a number of different causes can all find support for their cause in this kind of installation.
Our focus is to depave areas of San Francisco that don't need to be paved and plant gardens, specifically to beautify, which is the neighborhood treasure component, and also to help manage stormwater. The mayor has given up a parking spot for the day. We've taken it over to do a temporary park installation. So what we're doing is asking people to give a shovel full of dirt to help plant the dahlia that is in each of these wheelbarrows. The dahlia is the city flower for San Francisco.
We have installed a temporary park here in Rossmere Karimi's parking spot, and we're just trying to draw attention to open space issues within the city and show how much of an impact green space can have in an urban environment.
Central Park is a collaboration between Isabel and Charlie, and it's about petroleum and the fact that so much is taken as natural
in the environment, and we're making a parody about it.
Behind us, people have to pay to sit down and eat, whereas here you can eat for free. We have a request to see the meter to pay our rent. We're renting the space for the afternoon.
Well, this is the Hanging Gardens / backdoor patio of San Francisco. And we have these nice hanging plants and lattice. It's just like sitting in your own backyard out on the street.
Some people came by, had lunch, sit down at the table. It's been a good day.
Beautiful.
Love it. We love that idea. We want to do this. We want to have lunch in a parking space that we want to transform now. We want to do it too. And take the space back from the cars. I think it's great to take over such a public piece of space.
We are here promoting public space as well as bike lanes. We are taking out a short-term lease on public space and turning it into something pretty. Over 70% of public land in downtown San Francisco is used for automobile parking, and we decided, since today is International Car-Free Day, that we would put it to better use and make a park.
Since we're interested in connecting people with their food in a more intimate way, we're requiring them to experiment because we don't see in the safe way, we don't see lemons like this. And they're amazingly fragrant, but these are the ones that grow when we let them grow naturally.
Delicious. Very fresh. Tasty.
I can't get enough of this. I could sit here all day.
It feels awesome. Clean. Great.
So you kind of get the picture there. What they're trying to do is sensitize people in San Francisco to how nice it would be if they could bring in more open space in the middle of the streets there. Now, that's a kind of environment where it would be difficult to experience some of these other characteristics of restorative environments. So a park in San Francisco like that, an impromptu park, it may not have what Kaplan's refer to as soft fascination. That tends to be a less sort of chaotic, dramatic environment where you're able to kind of reflect quietly on events that aren't too extreme or too acute or anything like that. So they call that soft fascination. Clouds, sunsets, scenery, motion of leaves and breeze, patterns that hold your attention, but in some undramatic fashion. Some fascination is so powerful that one cannot at the same time think of anything else. Soft fascination, by contrast, permits a more reflective mode. So if you're in the middle of an earthquake, you might be fascinated by that, scared, but fascinated. But that's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about a more reflective, contemplative kind of fascination. Yeah. So Lisa's saying maybe all that grass isn't so sustainable in a sense because you've got to water it, you've got to a lot of people mow it. So that's a very interesting point. There may be these trade-offs between having the greenery, but is there too much of a good thing where you've got to put so much resource into keeping it going? And so a lot of people have gone to sort of desert yards now where there's not as much maintenance because of that issue. But, typically when people have a choice, and we'll see it in some of these other slides, they tend to like being around greenery. But you're right, to keep that up, especially in a dry climate, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of energy. So, good point. Now, in the next slide, they define what is meant by compatibility. Remember, we talked about compatibility not being control over the environment necessarily. So rather than leading to control, wilderness experience leads to a sense of awe and wonder or relatedness. Not only are such feelings conducive to a sense of control, they put the whole issue in a new perspective, like your role in the world. You start to kind of reflect on that, think about that, these larger issues. It's no longer important to remain in control at all, or at all times. So environments could be sufficiently under control, but not under our own personal control. There's a difference there. Extent. And this photo here is my younger son, Andy, when he was in Sri Lanka last summer, and he climbed up this mountainous area called Sirajira in Sri Lanka. And I think it's probably a good example of kind of what they mean by an environment that affords extent. It's something so vast surrounding you that it kind of prompts you to think about what's your place in this broader universe. These kind of scenes here, people camping out near the mountains, they see a rainbow. So to achieve the feeling of extent, it's necessary to have interrelatedness of the immediately perceived elements so that they constitute a portion of a larger whole. Thus, there must be sufficient connectedness to make it possible to build a mental map and sufficient scope to make building the map worthwhile. So you're trying to get a schema or a map of how things more broadly than your immediate environment sort of fit together, their meaning, their coherence. And we talked about sense of coherence when we talked about personality. Antonovsky's work, why was it that some people who went through very traumatic events in concentration camps were able to get past that and cope with it and go on to very productive lives? Because they saw somehow they were able to create meaning and coherence across the different phases of their life. Now, this is a very interesting study. The paper was not assigned for you to read, so I just want to describe what they did. It's done by Nancy Wells and Gary Evans, two folks that were previously in social ecology at Irvine. Gary was a professor here for a number of years, and Nancy was a postdoc here. And what they did is they were very interested in understanding how nearby nature around homes might affect children's psychological distress. So they came up with a naturalness scale, a way of rating the degree of nature in terms of the views from the living room and kitchen. What's outside when you look out a window? Are you seeing nature? Are you seeing concrete, a wall, a side of another house? Are you seeing grass? How many live plants are in the living room? So they coded these different environments, these family homes, in terms of 3 being the most nature present, 2, 1, or 0 being the least category. And then, is the nearby yard predominantly grass, dirt, concrete, or others? So they summed those different dimensions into a naturalness scale of nearby nature. So this is not spectacular nature. It's not Zion National Park. It's simply the plants and vegetation around somebody's home. And their subjects in this study were 337 children in rural counties of upstate New York in grades 3 through 5. So they were 3rd to 5th graders, about 9 years old average age. And they wanted to know whether living amidst nature or not living amidst nearby nature had any effect on their psychological distress, especially when you take into account what kind of stressful life events are going on in their lives. So obviously, if someone has more stressful life events, they're going to be more distressed. But does nature help buffer that? Does that sort of tamp down the amount of stress people have if they're being picked on in school, or if their family has moved around a lot and they're going through other kind of stressors? So they developed a stressful life event scale that made sense for third to 5th graders. Things like being bullied at school or being liked by your friends, changes in your family life and having to move a lot. That was their stressful life event scale for children. And then they had a psychological distress scale where they were able to probe the extent to which the child was bothered by feelings of not being accepted by peers or feeling upset about other things in their life. So these were all geared to children about 9 to 10 years old. And in this slide, you see some of their results. This is their psychological distress measure. And these different categories here are the levels of stressful life events that the children were experiencing, so from low to high life events. And the light-colored and the dark-colored columns are low nature for the light and high nature nearby their home for the dark columns. And what you see is, generally, as children go through more actual stressful life events, they do report higher distress. But what's interesting is the differences between the children in the low and high nature group for the people who are not going through much stressful life event is not that pronounced. It's much more pronounced here, where you have a lot of stressful life events. Here you get the buffering effect of being close to nature, whereas the children who don't have much nature near their home are showing much more psychological distress. So they call that an interaction effect. Not too much difference here in this condition of the study, but as you get to the high stressful life events, that's where having nature around is really important in buffering the stress. So it was an interesting kind of indication that nearby nature, at least for these kids living in rural New York, had a beneficial effect, especially when they were going through stressful life events, in keeping or lowering their distress levels relative to kids that didn't have that benefit of nature around them. Now, this is not a randomly controlled study. It's not as if they assign families to live near or not near nature, and they couldn't determine how many life events, stressful life events the kids had. They could only group them into these categories and then statistically try to control for confounding factors. Now, this is a different kind of study. It's an epidemiological study in England with 40,800,000 people, okay? A lot more people here in this study. And again, it's not a randomized controlled study where people are assigned to the different conditions, but rather they grouped the population into how much nature they had nearby and their health problems. So let's take a look at the next slide. And what they're talking about here is health inequality and access to nature. So as you go across these different colors from income group 2, which is more affluent, the income group 1 is the most affluent. So these measures are in relation to the most affluent group. But as you get to income group 4, that's the most deprived group, income deprived group. And also what you find, so here you see the income deprivation quartiles 2 to 4 with 1 least deprived. And then they're stratifying it by exposure to green space. So they were able for all these individuals to find out where they lived and plot that on a map and go to a database of land uses in England. And one of the data sets in that land use data database was how much nature is present in a particular parcel of land. So they were able to group these different 40 million people according to whether they were highly exposed to green space or not so exposed. And what you see here is that first of all, there's clearly an effect of income on health. So when you look at all-cause mortality and deaths from heart disease, circulatory disease, as you go up in income deprivation, you have more health problems, more disease. So we know that. There's also a kind of effect of exposure to green space where the health problems are generally less for people that are living in environments that have more green space. But again, the interesting point here is the interaction effect between green space and income deprivation. And what you see here in the most exposed to greenery group is that there's less of a slope or difference between the income deprived and least income deprived to the most income deprived. But whereas over here, where you have least exposure to green space, you see these much greater differences. They call this an incidence rate ratio, which is basically the ratio of affluent people getting sick to poor people getting sick. It's actually opposite of that. But it's a ratio of the two groups, the highly affluent, less affluent being sick or not. And so that ratio gets more pronounced when you have less exposure to green space. As you go out to the green space, these effects, these incidence rate ratios become smaller. So you can see that here, the differences are much smaller where you have the groups exposed to the most nearby nature. So those are some pretty interesting findings. Again, it's not a randomized controlled study, but it is a very large study with a great number of subjects controlled statistically for a lot of potential confounding factors. So is everybody clear, or any questions about the results from that study, what they were finding there? Yes. Jerry's asking, what's going on here? Why is this a little bit higher? And I'm not sure why that is, actually. But the important point is as you look at all 5 groups, from least exposure to greenery to most nearby nature, you're seeing this generally declining curve. So there's a little jump here, you're right. And I don't know why that is. But what is important is if you look across the 5 nature groups, you see this general decline in differences. The inequality comes out where you have huge differences between the affluent and the non-affluent. And those differences or inequalities are less when people are exposed to nature. So nature is buffering the health inequality effects on both all-cause mortality, that means all diseases lumped together, and then heart disease. Now, they reasoned that heart disease would be particularly susceptible because nature provides certain advantages that might reduce heart disease. So 1, nature might allow you to be more active in your neighborhood. 2, nature might improve your mood and reduce stress. So we know stress is related to cardiovascular disease. When they looked at that effect on lung cancer, highly related to smoking, and they looked at it for self-intentional injury, like people committing suicide, the effects, this interaction effect wasn't present. But it was present for all-cause mortality and circulatory disease. Yeah. Yes, you mean? Well, when you look at the differences between this least exposed to nature to the most exposed, or the least to the next least, I'm not sure why there's that jump there that Jerry asked about. But the important point is that there is this decline over the 5 groups where you're seeing the buffering effect of nature on the health problems. One of the things we know is that when you look at the most affluent group, and that would be group number 1 and then 2, they generally have a lot more nature in their backyards than people in the highly deprived group. So what they had to do in this study is they had to find enough people in the low-income group that were living both near nature and not near nature, and they were able to do that. But clearly there's a correlation between having a lot of income and having more nature. So we saw that in the film by the Irvine Company. You know, they put a huge investment in this planned community into nature, and we all benefit from that in a number of ways. Some would say, well, there's not enough other good things. You know, we're trading off diverse activities and recreation and nightlife. But nonetheless, they put a lot of investment into nature. You don't get that kind of investment in most low-income communities. Now we're going to look at another study where that's particularly the case. So from the Mitchell and Popham study that you read for today, a couple of their conclusions are that populations exposed to the greenest environments also have the lowest levels of health inequality or health disparities related to income deprivation. And that physical environmental amenities such as nearby nature, and it doesn't have to be a national park, you know, dramatic nature, it can be very undramatic vegetation or landscaping near your apartment or home, that can help reduce socioeconomic health inequalities. Now, before there were these kinds of studies, we didn't know that. We took for granted that nature's a nice thing, but we didn't know if it affected tangible outcomes like health. So these are pretty striking findings. Even though they're not randomized controlled studies, they are very suggestive. And when you put them together and look at the patterns across these studies, the Wells and Evans, Mitchell and Popham, and others that have been done, you start to see a very powerful effect of nature on people's well-being. Now, in this slide is another set of studies done by Frances Kuo, she was a PhD student of Stephen and Rachel Kaplan at the University of Michigan. She's now at the University of Illinois, and she has a laboratory to study the effects of nature on people. And some of her research looked at this housing project in Chicago. So we talked about Cabrini Green in Chicago, which was torn down. Robert Taylor Housing is another infamous housing project, low-income project in Chicago that has been plagued by a lot of problems in terms of gang violence, in terms of racial tensions. But what you see is that when she measured the amount of nature that people had near their project buildings, and she was able to find enough variation around those low-income buildings of apartments that faced trees or some vegetation, those that didn't. And when she interviewed those families, she found a lot more negative mood, more family violence and aggressiveness among the families that had no view of nature, no proximity to nature near their apartment, compared to those that did have some. And granted, it might have been feeble amounts of nature, but it was still something. And in those situations, she found enhanced mood, that D ought to be up there, improved coping, reduced impulsivity, lower crime rates. So here she's finding actually difference in crime rates among people living in this low-income housing project as a function of whether they are close to nature near their apartment or they're not. That's a pretty interesting finding. In this group here, the Barron View buildings, impaired coping, greater impulsivity, and higher crime rates. So the suggestion here is that proximity to nature actually helps people regulate their moods, regulate their impulses, and not engage in as much violence and crime. So that's another quite interesting finding. Now, another paper that you read for today is by Lewis, and it's about gardening programs adjacent to low-income housing projects in New York, Philadelphia, and other large cities. And these have been sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They've been sponsored by the New York Housing Authority. So those are two examples here where they set up gardening contests. They give residents seeds, rakes, what they need to start planting a garden. Just like in San Francisco, people brought that in. So the the Housing Authority or the Department of Agriculture is providing this to set up a gardening contest. And the logic model or the rationale behind this program is that by establishing this contest and providing people the wherewithal to start a garden in a low-income housing area, this enhances their interpersonal relationships, but also enriches their relationship with plants. They call it the people-plant relationship. So they're saying that that's an intervening psychological and behavioral process here, getting to know your neighbors better, communing with the plants, feeling like you're taking care of something and nourishing it. And those psychological processes then lead to these outcomes: aesthetic and nutritional benefits of the flowers and the vegetables they grow, mental and physical health benefits, improved self-esteem, physical activity, self-efficacy, more mental clarity, social benefits, increased neighboring, civic pride, and reduced crime rate. They even engage gang members in taking care of the garden, so they pull them into it. And it's really quite a positive program, and it creates what's called social capital, features of social organizations such as networks, norms, and social trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. And next Tuesday, we're going to talk more about social change, social interventions in the environment. We've been talking a lot about physical interventions like planting gardens, but how do you implement changes in the social environment? Because we know the physical and the social are very closely related, so we should pay attention to social change processes as well. So we talk about that next Tuesday. Now at this point, before we go to that, let's play we want to go back to the Badass Gardener. Remember we played that last week, and he talked about how he started his sort of impromptu little plot of garden in Brooklyn. And so this is the follow-up, part 2. So we want to see what happened to him over that year.
Is there such a thing as a badass vegetable garden? Or when you sneak onto private property at midnight to avoid police and illegally plant tomatoes, potatoes, and zucchini on an abandoned trash heap like a group of vigilantes? I'd say this is as badass as a vegetable garden can get. It started out as a pretty pitiful garden. By the end of June, everything began to flower, and I found that I had helpers near and wide dumping water on a regular basis. Marjorie, she's this old-school New Yorker who saw my original video about the garden, so she bought me cucumbers and zucchini. Peter, this old man from across the street, he found me weeding late one Friday night, and he broke into this series of dirty jokes. I was trying to change the subject, and I mentioned that my tomatoes were getting too big to support their own weight. And a few days later, I found 7 tomato stands waiting for me in my garden. I started to get my first crop of cherry tomatoes. The zucchini and squash scaled the fence and bloomed flowers and covered the rusty barbed wire. I treated my plants like they were my children. This is an analogy that always felt weird when I cooked and ate them. One day I'm sitting at my stoop about a block away from the garden, and I see this guy hop the fence and grab one of my lemon squash. I ran over and I confronted him. This is how episodes of Law & Order start out. Was I going to get myself shot over some underdeveloped lemon squash? Turns out he was embarrassed and incredibly apologetic. He thought it was a weed vegetable, didn't notice the rest of the garden. It wasn't a very believable story, but he was genuinely a nice guy, and he had a garden of his own, and he offered to trade me 2 of his squash for 1 of mine. I accepted gladly. I originally planned to give half of the yield to either the owner of this spot or someone who really needed it. And considering the amount of junk food wrappers that I cleaned out of this garden, I'd say that my neighborhood could really use some more vegetables. So I started offering the people who passed by to grab a tomato when they saw one. I was kind of amazed at how many people didn't even know what a tomato plant looked like, let alone the experience of picking it off the plant and eating it fresh. I mentioned to Marjorie that I'd like to give something to the owner if I could find them.
Let's do that church on the corner.
Oh, really?
That's for Armenian Catholic Church.
I knew what I had to do now. My girlfriend, a trained chef, made some of the best homemade salsa you've ever tasted, using ingredients from the garden. You know, after planting a badass garden, the last place I thought I'd end up was Catholic Mass. But there I was, listening to religious chanting, with only my camera and a jar of homemade salsa.
My name is Todd. Actually, I have a gift for you. I grew a garden in front of the parking lot this spring.
Oh, you're the garden?
Yes.
This is your handiwork?
Yes.
The fruit of your labor?
I ended up eating lunch with them, and they were very kind people. They told me that they noticed the garden, and they nearly tore it down, but it ended up inspiring them to fix it up for next year. This summer, my garden survived an earthquake, a hurricane, and the wrath of God. But Brooklyn had an early winter and the season was over, so I composted the dying plants, and I cleaned out the trash one last time, and I found either a note to me, or perhaps the most serendipitous piece of litter ever.
What's it say?
Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, to all the people you can, or as long as you ever can. John Wesley. I don't know if someone left that or not for me, but
if this spot is neglected in the future, I can assure you, I'll be back. Next year, I'm thinking of going big, so if someone out there keeps a neglected spot, you better start cleaning it up, or a mishmash group of vigilante gardeners might sneak in there and make it nice.
So we've seen some creative efforts to bring green space to urban areas. One point that I think is important to make about the Kaplan's theory of restorative environments is that it doesn't always have to take place in nature or wilderness. So this can happen in urban environments. And we showed a natural environment, Paley Park in New York City. But we could also be talking about activities in which people find a sense of enjoyment, satisfaction, or what Abraham Maslow, a famous psychologist, called self-actualization. You know, his theory is that as people are able to take care of their physiological and subsistence needs and safety needs, they start looking for other things higher up the ladder: love, esteem. And at the uppermost pinnacle of need fulfillment, you have self-actualization, where people actually become their potential, what they really want or strive to be. So when people engage in activities, it could be in an urban environment, it could be a natural environment, that they are in a kind of flow state where they really enjoy doing that, and it gives them pride and fulfillment, that can be a source of restoration. It doesn't have to be just exposure to nature or a natural environment. So this is Maslow's need pyramid or hierarchy. Self-actualization is the human desire for self-fulfillment, or the tendency to achieve your potential. And these are the different needs. And when people are dealing with crime and violence and physiological issues in their neighborhoods, it's very hard for them to be thinking about getting up this ladder of self-actualization. But even in those situations, people are able to identify something, often an activity, a kind of pursuit in life that they really are committed to and they love, and that can be a source of self-actualization. So you can have a lot of struggling artists who are not very wealthy. Maybe they're living in poverty, but they're doing what they love, and so they're somewhat actualized. So there are different restoration pathways. Okay, one pathway is social interaction and support. So by being with other people in a third place or some other kind of environment where you get some mutual reinforcement and support, that can be restorative. That can be something that you take a break from your studying, you go out with some friends, you get some kind of change of pace where you get a kind of social validation or support. Non-social activities can also bring some restoration. So you go to a church or some other building that has symbolic value, and you kind of relate to that in a meditative way. That can be restorative. It doesn't have to be social. Or it can be solitary. You can work in your den or your study, painting or knitting or doing some activity that you really love. And even though you work at it till you get tired and fatigued, it's still a type of self-actualizing activity that can bring you restoration. So there are these different pathways that create restoration. You can go to the Louvre, and there you have a kind of mixture of pathways. So you have a social environment where people are going with their families or friends. They're seeing something very beautiful. They're seeing artwork for the ages there. So it's a mixture of social and aesthetic kinds of pathways, yes. If people are truly engaged in an exercise regimen where it's part of their identity and it's part of their flow state, where they, just like meditation can be like that, I think it can be restorative. And certainly a lot of research suggests that people that engage in physical exercise more often are less depressed. They're more psychologically comfortable, positive mood. So it's a great point. Pardon me? Solitary, yes, solitary, certainly. And it can be social exercise as well. These are my sons again, Andrew, the younger one, and Eli, the Pothole Patrol TV reporter. And they both met up in India last summer and had a great opportunity they flew into Delhi and had an opportunity to explore parts of Rajasthan, and they met up with Chitvan and Dr. Misra there actually in Ahmedabad. And so for them, it was a very kind of restorative experience because they had their own sort of Darjeeling limited experience, the brothers going through northern India. And great times. They came out with a kind of iPhoto picture book from their trip, which is kind of fun. So, there are a lot of different ways you can engage in restoration. You can go to a beautiful environment like the Taj Mahal, and obviously that has some impact on you when you see that. But they're there also in terms of a relationship and a kind of bonding experience. Just as people going to this museum are probably there for a variety of different reasons. So it's not just being in a natural environment or a wilderness park, but there are many different pathways to achieving restoration. Now we know that art museums also have this restorative potential, and there have been studies done by Kaplan, the same Steve Kaplan that we've been talking about with restoration theory. And he, Bardwell, and Slachter have done studies both at the Toledo Art Museum, and also they did some data analysis of focus groups from the J.P. Getty Museum in L.A. And they find that, and this is a study published in Environment and Behavior, they find that indeed people that go through museum environments come out reporting experiences that sound like restoration, but not necessarily for all visitors. So people that typically don't go to art museums may go through that environment and not get much out of it. They don't feel that restored. But people that have cultivated an interest in art get a lot of restorative potential by going there. So this urban place where you can be exposed to a lot of aesthetic stimuli is a great source of restoration. How many of you have been to the Noguchi Sculpture Garden in Costa Mesa? It's a beautiful example of using nature as art and providing a restorative environment for the people that work in these high-rise commercial office buildings. And this is near South Coast Plaza, where you can go into this environment. And Noguchi tried to approximate different regions of California. So you've got the deserts, you've got the forest areas of Northern California. And it's quite an enjoyable environment. If you go to that website, you can see more of it. We already talked about bringing nature indoors. So a lot of companies now are getting around to the idea that, hey, this is not only something people like, it's good for our bottom line. If we can get our workers to relax more, give them some restorative environments during their workday, they're going to be more effective, they're going to be more productive. So some of your more progressive companies, like Google and some of these other offices, Chamber of Commerce in Slovenia, are bringing nature into the environment, or they're putting offices in natural environments so people can get the benefit of that restoration. And this is a meditative environment. It's not a nature environment, but it's a meditative environment by a fabric artist or designer named Talia Draheim in Northern California. And finally, this picture here. How many of you have been to the Huntington Beach Library? Yeah, it's worth a trip. What did you think of it when you went there? And one of the beautiful things about it is how they've integrated the nature indoors with the nature outside in the park area. So it's like you've got nature sort of bridging the indoor and the outside area. Let me just show you a few more quick slides from the 35 millimeter. Beth, you want to flip the switch on that? This is a slide from some of the Kaplan's early research. This dimension here is preference, people's stated preferences for photographic slides. Okay, that's good. That's all right. And this here is the complexity of what's pictured in those photographic slides. So you could bring people into a lab, show them pictures of urbanscapes, landscapes, and then urban nature, sort of mixed slides. So the filled in circles are the nature slides, purely nature. The open square slides are urban slides, and then the open circles are sort of mixtures where you might have some urban nature. And you can see that generally when you show people many, many different slides of these types of environments, they have a strong preference, very strong preference for nature slides that tend to be more complex visually. So even when you're in the urban zone here, the more visual complexity, it becomes more interesting. And that's one of the things that people say about planned communities. They're not visually different enough or varied enough. So some people don't like that. So to live in a place, whether it be Irvine or Laguna Beach, you have to have sort of values. You have to have interests that sort of fit that environment. Now, given that preference for nature, this is a nice area of Carmel Beach. This is Bouchard Gardens in Victoria. People pay good money to go into gardens so that they can have these aesthetic nature experiences. This is one of Chris Alexander's patterns, number 60, called Accessible Green. And he knew intuitively that the more you could bring nature into an office or a work environment or home or give people views of it, the better their experience of that environment would be, the more effective of an environment it would be. This is a building in Ottawa, Canada, in the middle of winter. And I was on a conference trip here, and I went into this building, and it looked like a little forest, a rainforest in there, where they had brought in all these plants in the lobby. So it was almost like you were in a different type of region or climate. So they put a lot of investment into bringing nature inside. This is a product called Topsiders, where you can put these planter boxes on the top of office cubicle dividers so that people at least have some contact with plants there, even if they might be in an enclosed indoor area. So here you don't have much window space going on, but you've got at least the plants. So that's a product that's being used. This is a view of the Noguchi Sculpture Garden in Costa Mesa from one of the buildings looking down. And this is the Sierra Forest here, where, this is more the desert and mountain area, symbolic of that. And here in this forested area, workers come out of these buildings and they have lunch out here, and they're able to sort of surround themselves with the greenery. So it's really a nice amenity for the people working in a fairly urbanized area. So let me tell you a couple of things about Thursday and next week. On Thursday, Mark's going to be presenting a very interesting lecture on the environmental psychology of the Internet. And he's done research for one of his earlier projects on Second Life, which is a virtual community. And he actually joined Second Life and became a participant. So he's going to tell you about some of his experiences of that. So we'll be talking about the Internet and how environmental psychology brings something new to understanding virtuality.